What do you think about this? I mean, do you think Mussorgsky was setting himself up on a pedestal, or was he just setting himself apart?
Yeah, the latter, I would say. I mean, I think it just goes to show how much he was aware that his choice of subject matter was very provocative, and I think he intentionally did choose the topic that way. If you look at the opera he was working on before he started on Boris Godunov, it was on the Old Believers, the sect of Old Believers, who actually regarded Peter the Great as the Antichrist. You know, so he already had been intent on getting at the national lore of Russia and those legends that were really steeped in a lot of mystery and controversy. I think it was the perfect subject for him. And when you look at his sources in Alexander Pushkin and Nikolai Karamzin, you also see where he takes advantage, as much as he can, of the psychological realism, especially in as much as Karamzin's history did not really even dwell on the perceived guilt of the Tsar so much as a murderer, although it was Karamzin who was the principal source for pointing the finger at Boris Godunov for being the murderer of the Tsarevich Dmitry. So Pushkin, of course, capitalized on that theme in his mini-drama, and so when Mussorgsky took the topic, he really honed in on that psychological realism about the conscience of the Tsar, rather than, as the historian Karamzin did, really speak more of the consequences for the reign of the Tsar. It wasn't really so much a personal drama in the original narrative of
Well, I'm glad you brought up the historian, because I've always kind of wondered if the character of Pimen is in some way sort of an homage to Karamzin. I mean,
it could very well be. I would actually suspect that it is through Pushkin. Who wrote the character Pimen into his mini tragedy, and I think it probably is.
Well, in the great tradition of rabble-rousers and revolutionaries everywhere, Mussorgsky was not born poor and oppressed, much to his chagrin in some ways. He actually sprang from the upper classes. Let's talk a little bit about his life and his background. Would you like to comment on that, Lonnie?
Could I defer to Dr. Anderson?
Okay.
Well, I don't know a great number of details.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what I do know, which is that he actually came from, fairly aristocratic background. He was a cadet in the Imperial Guard, graduated from the academy in 1856, I think it was, and then moved on to this very elite regiment, the Preobrazhensky Imperial Life Guards, and was a snappy dresser. He was witty, intelligent, charming, apparently a great punster. Is that a particularly Russian thing, puns?
Russians are big on
They
puns.
like wordplay, don't they?
I think so. A lot of wordplay, definitely.
Yeah. And, he was evidently, everything you would want an officer to be, but regrettably, the other skill that he acquired during his years in the military was the ability to drink like a fish. And alcoholism played a tremendous role in his life and his career, particularly after his mother's death in 1865, evidently. And so, let's talk about that a little bit. Are you familiar with the portrait that everyone sees of Modest Mussorgsky, which was done just weeks before his death by Ilya Repin?
Right.
He just looks a mess.
That's just shattered.
Yeah. It's the one that's used in all the histories.
Yeah.
Still, instead of anything earlier.
Right. I mean, he's red-nosed and disheveled and sick and impoverished, wearing rags. And it's hard to look at that portrait and understand that these works were the works of a young man.
Yeah.
Not some old man who was about to kick it.
Right. Of course, that portrait is used. That's very interesting, because really, when you go to the music histories and you get to the chapter on the Mighty Five, you get to Mussorgsky, and inevitably there's that mess of a picture. It's just a mess. And this is fascinating. And one of the reasons it's fascinating is because, of course, this is off on a tangent, isn't it? But the way that doing history developed in the late 19th and early 20th century with respect to music history is that we love geniuses that are in some way oppressed. We love that. It's the Beethoven complex.
Well, I think it's the only thing that makes it fair.
You don't want to
Because,
put
if they're
Beethoven
genius,
out there
why shouldn't
sipping
they?
a cup of coffee, do you? You want him like that.
Yeah.
And you because you want him to, this image of stamping up and down, the deaf guy stamping up and down, fighting to get every note and fighting to get every word, and then you get the Ninth Symphony and the Missa, which is great, of course. But this is the image. This is the image that comes out, and it's particularly strong at the beginning of the 20th century. And in fact, when Mussorgsky is coming up, this kind of genius that's not carried on the wings of song, but rather one that must fight for everything that he gets. This is why Mendelssohn has never been terribly popular, because it's brilliant. Because despite also there's the Jewish element, which is a big deal in German music history, of course, but also the fact that Mendelssohn had everything kind of. The perception is it's all given to him. It's easy for him. It's easy.
Yeah, but if he'd made a pact with the devil, that probably would have upped the
that would have upped the ante. And the picture we have of Mussorgsky is also of this kind of fighting for everything. Everything's difficult, but everything's worthwhile in the end.
Speaking of everything difficult, let's talk about medieval Russia for a minute. Who the heck were the Boyars? Where did they come from, and where did they go to?
Yeah, well, the Boyars were the hereditary nobility. They were the families of princes who, from the times of Kievan Rus, which was the original center of Russian political and cultural life, the princes normally had principalities, and upon their death, the principalities would be divided among the sons of those various princes. And so, as you can imagine, those territories became very scattered. There came to be quite a number of them. And after a lot of strife and infighting among those sons and heirs of some of the grand princes, around about the 15th and 16th centuries, some of those princes who came to prominence gathered those principalities together through a lot of conquest, and in particular, Ivan III, who's called Ivan the Great, the first of the greats among the many czars who earned that title, and his son Vasily III.
Well, I was going to say something about earning the title, but
earning whether or not they
in
deserved
some
it.
cases,
Yeah, in some cases,
in others,
maybe,
not so much.
Maybe exactly,
Yeah.
precisely.
Yeah.
And so, and then by the time you get to Ivan, not the Great, but the Terrible, Ivan IV, known as the Terrible, as you know, and the Boyars by that time had really lost a lot of their prominence, and this was one of the thorns in the side of Ivan the Terrible, of course, because the Boyar families were vying for power, and he was the Tsar, probably more than any others, who managed to limit and diminish the power of the Boyar families. And so by the time you get to the reign of Boris Godunov, and of course resulting from the succession crisis after Ivan the Terrible had left his empire only to an infant son, the Boyars, of course, were all intent on gaining the throne, and there were a number of them who, of course, wanted to have that prominent position. And so Boris had this struggle to contend with throughout his reign, which was rife with a lot of other political turmoil and, as you know, border wars and things like that. And so this is, where the struggle with the Boyar family came about, and, Boris himself had to be a very ruthless ruler in the tradition of Ivan the Terrible in order to maintain his own hold on power.